The first chapter in the evolution of 3D Spider-Man games has come to an end, but we aren't out of the PS1 era just yet. Spider-Man 2000, to no one's surprise, was a huge success, so obviously a sequel was to come. How's it going, everyone? My name is Sebastian, and today we finally continue through the Spider-Man games as we enter Electro. That sounded kinda wrong, but I'm gonna go with it anyway. 1 year after the success of Spider-Man 2000, Enter Electro was released, this time developed by Vicarious Visions, whose most recent project involved bringing my childhood back from the dead. So how does the second iteration of a 3D Spider-Man game hold up today? And how did it mix up the formula that made the first one so popular? Now, unlike last time when we were greeted by the remix of the classic 60s theme on the title screen, this game's title screen just abruptly pops in with no music or sound effect whatsoever. It's really awkward and definitely would have benefited from having some kind of audio to it. Even if it's not as good as the song from the first game, at least have something. Once we do as the muted screen says and press start, we're greeted by a recap of the events from the first game.
Previously on Spider-Man.
This would have been a nice little intro to the game's story had the two games' plots actually connected in some way. None of the events from the previous game have any impact on this one whatsoever, so the addition of this previously on is a little strange, since you can play either game independently, and not need the context of the other. Aside from Spider-Man, none of the characters from the previous game even make a return in this one. Well, I mean, there is a gag that some characters show up for, but we'll get to that later. For the most part, this is a completely new story, with an entirely different cast of characters. What I do find interesting is that they use the Dreamcast cutscenes instead of the PS1 version. Up until now, I had never actually seen the Dreamcast version of Spider-Man 2000, so I was surprised to find out that that version actually has Spider-Man sporting his classic webbing on his suit. So that left me thinking, maybe it was a technical limitation that they couldn't add it on the PS1, but that doesn't make any sense either because the web suit carries over into Enter Electro, so clearly the PS1 can handle this texture. You know, making these videos has left me even more confused as to why Spider-Man 2000 doesn't have the webbing on the suit, but you know, whatever. I'm starting to get really off topic, so let's just go back into Enter Electro. But wait, we obviously can't go any further into the game until we hover over the Kid Mode option for a few times.
Kid Mode.
Kid Mode. Kid Mode. Kid Mode.
Kid Mode.
Okay, I think that's enough. Well, maybe one more.
Kid Mode.
This time around, we open on Electro. I mean, what did you expect from a game called Enter Electro? Thus, Electro enters. He's breaking into a lab and stealing a device. We aren't given much context as to what the device is at this point, or what Electro is really doing. This opening cutscene, in my opinion, is nowhere near as engaging or layered as the setup for the first game. In Spider-Man 2000, we immediately set up Doc Ock being reformed, an imposter Spider-Man, Venom being loose, and a mysterious villain who gassed the city. Whereas here, all we really get is Electro stole something. There's really no talking in this cutscene either, really only Electro saying in a really annoying voice that doesn't fit him at all. After a quick tutorial with Beast from the X-Men, Spidey is swinging around the city, when suddenly, he runs into some kind of robbery, and the guys responsible are taking off with a briefcase. As you progress, you find out that many of Spider-Man's arch-enemies, like Shocker, Sandman, Hammerhead, and Beetle, are passing around this briefcase to each other, sending Spider-Man in a wild goose chase, trying to find out what's in it and who they're all working for. It turns out, in a shocking twist, all of them are working for Electro, and helping him finish his device. However, they need Dr. Watts' help to get it working. So they kidnap her, leaving Spider-Man in charge of finding out where they took her to, saving her, and finding out what all these villains are planning. Being completely honest here, this game's story is nowhere near as interesting to me as the first game. Granted, the first game's story was nothing insanely amazing either, but it did allow for more cameos with the whole imposter Spider-Man arc, and even though it was obvious and cheesy, it had a dumb twist. This game's story is so straightforward and has no surprises, and overall the stakes feel a lot smaller for whatever reason. The gameplay stays the same as the first game, since they are using the same game engine and a lot of the mechanics and animations were reused to save time. You still have the 3-hit combo that can consist of punching and kicking in any order you choose, and they actually did give the combos new animations, which I think look a lot better and feel slightly faster than the first game. The overall feeling of fights is significantly better. Enemies stay stunned for longer after getting hit, so you no longer get immediately hit back after pulling off a combo like in the first game. This rebalancing significantly improves the combat, making it more fun. The way webs work are for the most part the same. Swinging is still limited in movement after choosing the initial direction to go in. You can still only really swing to something that is 2 swings away. However, I might be wrong here, but it did feel like the swings would extend a bit if something was a little farther away. In Spider-Man 2000, I had this issue where Spider-Man just wouldn't swing at all if the platform that you were swinging to was out of reach. However, I found that this issue was non-existent in Enter Electro, and I found myself dying to swinging errors a lot less. Web usage during combat has remained mostly the same. You can still do various web-based attacks such as tying up foes, shooting out a web ball, shielding yourself with a dome, busting out your web boxing gloves, and pulling enemies towards you. None of these moves feel like they've had any work done to them, or at least not anything significant. Like the first game, your webbing is limited to how many cartridges you have. You can actually run out of webbing, which I love as a mechanic. Being low on webbing creates a sense of intensity in the game, because in the back of your mind, you'll keep thinking, the game will be harder if you don't have webbing, which does help immerse you a bit as Spider-Man, who would be thinking the exact same thing in this situation. You can increase the amount of web cartridges you have by finding them throughout the level as blue spider symbols, and finding them is much more important than last time. In Spider-Man 2000, running out of webs wasn't something to be afraid of, since dying automatically gave you 7 cartridges upon respawning. In Enter Electro, you come back with the amount you had in the last checkpoint, so no free webbing this time around. You have to use it sparingly and somewhat tactically. This isn't all that bad since this game isn't as difficult as Spider-Man 2000, and that's mostly due to the fact that, from combat to swinging, the overall feeling of the controls is vastly improved, removing most of the unfair deaths and generally clunky feel that Spider-Man 2000 has. Along with the control improvements, this game has also added quality of life improvements as well. For starters, they added a lock-on system, making it easier to tell which enemy you're specifically attacking when surrounded or picking a specific one out of a bunch that you want to focus on. The manual lock-on crosshair from the first game makes a return, and this time, it can be used to lock on to faraway enemies, letting you web them up or knock them out from a distance, which creates more options for stealth other than just sneaking around. Using the manual aiming to swing also feels a lot more reliable this time around. The settings and layouts are pretty varied, but objectives do share similar kinds of puzzles. Aside from a couple unique levels, most of them aren't really as varied as the ones in Spider-Man 2000. This time around, the levels you'll explore include warehouses, labs, airfields, train yards, and of course, New York City. Something that is very worth mentioning about some of the city levels is that since there's no kryptonite fog excuse in the story, so there's no excuse to not be able to explore the ground. And Vicarious Visions actually threw in a couple levels where you explore the ground. In these levels, the buildings aren't as tall as the ones in the rooftop levels. However, being able to walk on the streets and swing up to a rooftop feels very satisfying. Having actual alleyways adds a whole new level of exploration, and they add a new dynamic to the way you view the city. The levels in this game have a bigger emphasis on puzzles and pulling switches to open doors. A lot of the levels have you finding a switch to open a door that leads to another switch that'll open another door somewhere else that has a switch in it for another door. And I'm telling you, you flip a lot of fucking switches in this game. The other repetitive level design is swinging from point A to point B. There's a few levels that don't really consist of much, except swinging from the start to the end. All you really have to do is follow the compass. But flipping switches and swinging past nameless enemies isn't the only thing you'll be doing. Stopping a runaway plane before it crashes, destroying turrets, rescuing hostages, and climbing up tunnels filled with lasers, electric walls, and crushing platforms are some of the more unique levels the game has to offer. Aside from the blue spiders for webbing and white ones for health, other things you'll be finding throughout these levels are power-ups. Making its return is the spider armor, which again gives you a shield over your health bar, essentially giving you 2 health bars. Gone are the flame webs from the first game, instead they are replaced with 2 new kinds of webbing. The first of which being freeze webbing. Freeze webbing can make it so that you can stun webbed up enemies faster, for longer, and for less webbing. It can also be used with the other web attacks, making them stronger. The second web-based power-up is electric webbing. Electric webbing only appears in levels that have drones and other robotic enemies. Normally, it takes a lot of regular webbing to take out drones, but when you have the electric webbing, they die almost instantly. Shooting a tiny amount of electric web at a drone or a turret will instantly disable them. It'll also power up your other web attacks just like the freeze webbing. Even though you can combine the power-up webbing with the special web attacks, there's really no point, since it costs way more to do, and a simple web line is just as effective, and for way less webbing. I already mentioned some of Spider-Man's rogues gallery that are running amok. The bosses in this game are just as well designed as the ones from the first game. Again, each with their own strategy to beat. Starting off with Shocker, and I know that I just kinda praised the game a little for having interesting boss fights, but Shocker is not one of them. Shocker goes around doing his Shocker thing,
Calling yourself the Shocker. I'm the Shocker. I shock people. What is this, pro wrestling?
and tries to shock you, and the way you beat him is by dropping crates on his head. The reason I don't like this fight is because unlike every other boss fight in both games, the strategy to beating him doesn't feel unique to him. It's like they couldn't figure out a fun gimmick for him, so they just kinda thought, hey, just drop something on his head. I also think that the camera in this fight is really annoying because it tries to stay locked onto Shocker, which makes it awkward to move around. Next we have this pseudo boss, it's not really a boss, against Sandman. Spider-Man is chasing a train, and Sandman keeps trying to slow you down by making giant sand walls and fighting Spider-Man himself. It's not really a fight, but I think it's cool and worth mentioning. Beetle shows up, but there's no boss fight with him. He just sort of leaves and kind of stands around and then he's gone. He really doesn't do anything at all, so I find it kind of weird that he's here in the first place, but you know. Next up we have Hammerhead, which is pretty cool for a couple reasons. For starters, the Hammerhead fight has two strategies. One is that you can have him charge at you and jump out of the way, letting him slam his head into the wall and punching him while he's dazed. The other is webbing up his gun and pulling it away from him, then attacking him while he's distracted getting it back. The other reason I like this fight is because it changes stages. There's a moment where Hammerhead busts through a wall and suddenly you're fighting outside the building. And what's great about it is that you still have the option to go back in if you want. Next you have a fight with the Lizard, where you have to make an antidote that you load into your web shooters and shoot at him, trying to turn him back into Connors. You fight Sandman again, this time at a construction site, where you have to turn up the water pressure and release it on him in order to hurt him. With the exception of Shocker, the bosses in the game all feel unique and fit the characters really well. Aside from the villains, the Marvel representation in this game is lacking in comparison to Spider-Man 2000, which had appearances from Daredevil, Human Torch, Punisher, and Captain America. This game's main story really only has Beast making a cameo, although I will say Professor X and Rogue are also technically featured in the game under the character bio section. The Fantastic Four's Baxter building also makes a return, and there's a few other nods to characters from the Marvel Universe and newspapers. And speaking of newspapers, the comic book cover loading screens from each of the levels from the first game were replaced with Daily Bugle newspaper front pagers. These are really fun, and sometimes say pretty clever things on them, but I'd be lying if I said I like them more than the comic covers. Something I do really like about the newspapers though, is that sometimes fail states, mainly to boss fights, will give you a funny failure newspaper. And of course, the most important cameo in the game, Stan Lee reprises his role as Stan Lee, once again narrating the parts of the story throughout the game.
Welcome, true believers. Stan Lee here to bring you yet another scintillating tale of superhero daring-do.
So here we are. Everything you've gone through has now brought you to this point. Electro needs Zeus's tear, a sapphire that can power his device, so he plans on stealing it from the museum. You make your way through the Japanese exhibit, where you fight samurai armor that Electro somehow brought to life using his electric powers. After that, you make your way up a giant wall of the Earth's layers. Once you reach the top, you enter this evil lab-looking place where Electro is hanging out. This fight isn't really anything special. He just kinda stands there throwing out moves that look cool, however miss most of the time. Meanwhile, you just jump up to him and attack, and he just kinda takes it. So far for being the final level, this level is a little lackluster. You've gone through two unrelated and random settings from the Japanese and Earth exhibit, and now you have a pretty boring fight against the guy the game's been setting up this whole time. But don't worry, because the next and final phase of the level is pretty cool. For starters, Spider-Man walks in looking like hell. His suit is torn up and he looks like a mess. I feel like this detail really helps add to the epicness of the situation and emphasize everything you've gone through up until this point. The fight setting is pretty cool too. You're on a huge rooftop on top of a giant building. It's dark and raining around you. It looks really nice and makes this really feel like a genuine final boss. Unlike everything we've done in this level before this moment, which didn't feel epic enough to be a final level. This section sets up the tone you'd expect from a final battle. In the actual boss fight, you smash a bunch of generators and conductors to be able to both hurt Electro and prevent him from healing. Once they're all broken, you bait him into shocking one of these rods, which ends up shocking himself. Then you go in for the attack. It does feel a little repetitive and it's really easy, and I feel like Vicarious Visions knew it was repetitive because Spider-Man keeps commenting on how Electro is dumb enough to keep falling for it.
Man, you'd think a guy would get wise to this trick.
Now, I really don't like when games make self-aware jokes about their own game design. It just proves that the developers knows it's tedious, and is trying to justify it by making a quick joke. Electro is finally defeated, and New York can rest easy, knowing that they've been saved from an impending lightning-related death. And it's all thanks to our good old God of Thunder himself, Thor. Electro, Shocker, and Hammerhead get put away, and we cut to them playing a game of poker from a jail cell, just like how we saw the villains from the first game did. Then, Shocker asks the cell in front of them if they know how to play Go Fish, and we see that it's the villains from the first game. I actually like how the ending of this game ties into the first game. It's the only thing connecting these two games together, but it still ties a nice little bow around them, making it feel like they're both part of a complete package. We get a cool credit sequence of Spidey climbing up a building and looking at the dev team through the windows, which I think is a pretty cool way to do the credits. And just like that, we end our journey through Spider-Man 2 Enter Electro. The presentation of the game has definitely improved from last time. The character models were updated. Like I mentioned earlier, Spider-Man is actually sporting his webbing on his suit this time, which makes the character model look a lot nicer. They also added his classic web wings, which I think were a nice touch. Plus, the addition of the torn up suit at the end adds to the feel and presentation of the story. And let's say you really like that torn up suit, and we're disappointed that you can only really wear it in that one specific level all the way at the end of the game. Well, do I have some good news for you, because you can actually wear it as an unlockable costume, along with an insane amount of other suits. The suits from the first game all made a return, and they added so many more on top of that. It's insane how many suits are in this game, and they each have different abilities. And if you like a suit but don't want to use its ability, then don't worry, because of the Create a Spider feature, which lets you choose your own ability for a suit. And just like last time, you can unlock all of them by doing various tasks. Or if you simply don't have time to do that before you have to upload a video about Enter Electro on YouTube, you could just use the cheat codes to unlock them all. This time there was no kryptonite fog excuse for the render distance, so the levels look a lot better, with more detailed backgrounds. You don't really realize how lacking the first game's environments look until you compare it to Enter Electro. The music in this game has the same familiar 90s tone from the first game. However, unlike the first game's soundtrack, which I think is extremely memorable, the soundtrack in Enter Electro didn't leave any lasting impressions. It sounds nice while you're playing it, and you can feel the same vibe that the first one gave in the moment, but once that moment's gone, I have no real urge to go listen to it again on my own time. Overall, Enter Electro still holds up surprisingly well, and the improvements to the controls and gameplay help with that a lot. The game is just as fun as the first, and is a worthy sequel to it. I can't really say that one is better than the other though, since I feel like where one succeeds, the other fails, and where one fails, the other succeeds. So playing them both is definitely the way to get the best of both worlds and having the most conclusive and satisfying experience with PS1 era Spider-Man. If you've played Spider-Man 2000 before but haven't played this one, then you should check it out. I feel like a lot of people don't really ever bring up Enter Electro, at least not as much as Spider-Man 2000. And I don't really know why that is. So let me know if you played Enter Electro down in the comments below. Do you prefer it over its predecessor, or do you hands down prefer Spider-Man 2000? I'd like to know what you have to say about the game, so continue the discussion down below. Thank you all so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it. And if you did, I would greatly appreciate it if you'd show your support by giving it a like, sharing it with your friends, and leaving me any feedback you might have. Subscribe if you aren't already. I hope you have a great rest of your day and or night depending on when you watch the video. And with all that said, that's it for me for now, and I'll talk to you all next time.